Hey there, welcome to the AskHistorians podcast. Today in the podcast, we have user Coinsinmyrocket to talk about Dunkirk, how it happened, how it played out, and what it meant for World War II. Let's have a great discussion on the recent Dunkirk movie and how it was reviewed and how it got things done. It's a fun episode with a lot of great stories, but before we get to that, as the first episode of the month, we have our monthly book drawing for our Patreon supporters. The Patreon helps support the show and keeps it going, and we're so very thankful for all of you for making us one of the most popular history podcasts out there. For $1 a month, you get one drawing, for two for $5, and three for $10. This month, the winner will get to choose from Rich Atkinson's Amazing Army at Dawn: The War in North Africa, which is the first book in the best trilogy about World War II out there right now. The second book they can choose from is Blood Royale: The Wars of the Roses, 1462 to 1485 by Hugh Bicheno, which is billed as the concluding volume to this rousing two-part history of the War of the Roses, England's longest and bloodiest civil war, narrated by a master historian. Or the historical fiction this month is The Volcano Lover by Susan Sontag, which I am reading and enjoying right now. It is billed as being set in the 18th century Naples, based on the lives of Sir William Hamilton, his celebrated wife Emma, and Lord Nelson, and people with many of the great figures of the day. This month's winner is, drumroll please, Burke M. Thank you for being a supporter, Burke, and I will reach out to you via your Patreon email. The rest of you can support us on patreon.com/AskHistorians. I hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today we are joined by a member from the Ask Historians Community, user Coinsinmyrocket, flaired as Mid-20th Century Military and Naval History. He is joining us today to talk about the Phoney War, which touches on Dunkirk, but also surrounds several of the events around it. First things first, welcome to the Ask Historian podcast, Coins.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get started where we always start. What got you interested in history in general?
I think like most, kids, or I should say young boys, I got really into, castles and stuff like that. And then I had a parent who lived near numerous Civil War battlefields. And that kind of piqued my interest a little bit, just kind of snowballed from there.
So you just kind of got generally interested in Civil War battlefields, and what drew you to like 20th century military history when you started doing that?
So I came of age around the same time that, a lot of the greatest generation talk started up in the mid to late 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So you had Tom Brokaw's book, you had, Saving Private Ryan, and then Band of Brothers a few years later. Two things really kicked it off for me. I was able to watch, when I was around 11 years old, Schindler's List, and that definitely piqued my interest into wanting to know, hey, why did that happen and what led to that happening? And then about a year later, I'm sure, being on Reddit, a lot of people play video games. A video game called Medal of Honor came out for PlayStation, and I didn't really know a lot about World War II the first time I had played it. I knew of it. I knew some generalities of it. But that game, since it touched upon so many actual events, really, got my interest into 20th century military history and World War II history especially. It kicked it into overdrive.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever go on to study it at an academic level, like an undergrad, or did you go on to a graduate degree?
Yeah, no. So I did go to university, many years later, and I did actually get a degree in history, and I focused primarily on the Pacific War. So I moved away from the European theater in college and just kept my focuses on the naval aspect of the Pacific War. But since leaving university, I've still continued to read and occasionally write about topics surrounding both the Pacific War and the European theater.
So the topic today, we're talking about Dunkirk and the Phoney War. It's much more in line with what people tend to think of as like traditional history. That's like much more military, diplomatic history, rather than culture or things like I study or other historians study. So what does it mean to be a military historian to you specifically? So how does the field change from like just recounting the number of people that died on the battlefield versus the guns they used?
Yeah, so I personally, when I study military history, I think the grand scheme of things has been done to death. You know, the John Keegan way of doing military history, where you're studying, these pivotal events and what the generals were thinking and what the politicians were thinking. They're still important to learn and understand, but just like with cultural history and personal history, we're seeing history from the bottom up now.
Hmm.
And I try to take that approach with military history, because while I think it's certainly interesting to know what Churchill might have been thinking when he made a decision, or why Truman might have made a decision to drop the bomb or withhold it for a couple of days, I think you can learn more lessons today, finding out from someone who was on the ground, and or not even on the ground, back home, and how they felt about these events, and how it directly impacted them. And
So like a source, so like a source for you that you find interesting, like a soldier's personal journal or like newspapers from the time, seeing how individual people felt versus like Truman's diaries.
Correct. And in undergrad, I read through Admiral Nimitz's diaries, which are great. But on the flip side of that, you also have historians like Studs Terkel, who wrote two really good oral histories, one about the Great Depression, the other about World War II. And the great thing about those books, and that's really what pushed me into looking more at the bottom up approach with military history, was you were getting these aspects from these people that you weren't really getting in the grand scheme. With the grand scheme histories, you were getting hindsight was 2020. You kind of knew the conclusion before you finished the book, so there was really no concern or worry there. Whereas when you were reading, an oral history that Studs Terkel had conducted, or even Stephen Ambrose, despite all his faults, you were really getting that feel for how anxious or nerve-wracking or how excited people were when different events occurred, as opposed to just getting this grand overview of everything that is occurring.
I actually hadn't thought of that before because I guess my grasp of military history is generally from that sort of grand scheme. You know what happened in the end, but the personal diaries must be much more interesting from a perspective of anxiety and not knowing if they're actually going to win and feeling that they might, but not sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, again, I mentioned him previously, but Stephen Ambrose, despite his faults, we do have to give him a lot of credit, because Studs Terkel's books definitely brought oral histories into a greater limelight in the 80s. Ambrose, when he published Band of Brothers, that really helped push it into the mainstream, where people weren't just reading books that were just based on what MacArthur or Eisenhower were doing. You were reading about small units and getting it directly from those guys themselves, their opinions and their feelings on those events and how they occurred.
That's interesting. So, for the topic of today's discussion, I guess most people are sort of familiar with World War II. At least they understand that it has to do with the Nazis and the bad guys, and I guess Italy and Russia and like all of that. But like, can you give us kind of a general overview, like a bird's eye view of what things in Europe looked like leading up to the Phoney War?
Sure. So I'm sure, as most people know, or maybe some don't, Germany, up until September of 1939, had undergone a huge campaign of remilitarization and really building up their armed forces. In addition, they had begun land grabs in Czechoslovakia. You had the Anschluss in Austria. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that.
Hmm.
Um, and then this kind of comes to a head where in 1938, Germany wants to take the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, and the French and the British come to a peace conference in Munich, and we reach what is known as the Munich Agreement, saying, okay, Germany can take the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, but that's it, no more. And sure enough, a short while later, they took the rest of Czechoslovakia, and nothing happened. So, leading up to August of 39, Germany's making a lot of overtures that they're prepared to move in and take Danzig and German speaking peoples that are in Poland, take them back into the German nation. And of course, the British, led by Chamberlain, and France, led by Renaud, are both kind of taken aback. Like, look, we already had this agreement. If this happens, we have an agreement with Poland that we will come to their defense. You can't do this. So to cut a long story short, Germany invades Poland on September 1st, 1939, and that leads into World War II, and shortly thereafter the Phoney War.
Why would it be called the Phoney War? I mean, to me that seems like, oh, okay, something happened. It's time to go to war, and they start mobilizing troops and fighting, right?
Well, so here's the thing: Britain and France, they immediately declare war on Germany and by immediately, within a couple of days of the initial invasion. So September 3rd is when declarations of war are made. They declare war, and then not a lot happens. You have both countries are mobilizing their militaries, and they're making overtures that we will come to Poland's defense. But on the Western Front, in France, the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, even Western Germany, not a lot is happening. In fact, the first couple of actions are really just either limited border skirmishes or pamphlet bombing raids in which British bombers were dropping pamphlets over German cities and fortifications, essentially telling them, like, you've entered into a war which you cannot hope to win. But that's only on the mainland of Europe. In the Atlantic, the Battle of the Atlantic is starting up, and that's actually not phony. But the press, because you have this mobilization happening in England and in France, you have this mobilization, you have troops brought up to the border, and nothing. There's no action, as opposed to what happened in the previous war, World War I. You had fighting almost immediately. Whereas in the period that we know as the Phoney War, nothing really happens. People just sit there. And that's false, but because there are no major offensives, you basically have the press as well as officials in Europe and in America saying, this war is phony.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Battle of the Atlantic? I'm not was aware that there were ships fighting each other before even land forces started engaging.
Sure. So, the Battle of Atlantic, it kind of ramps up in a crescendo the same way that the land war does, but it ramps up much faster. I don't have the exact date in front of me, I'm sorry to say, but almost immediately after the war is declared, Germany doesn't have nearly as many U-boats as they need, but the ones that they do have, I want to say they were between 19 to 25 ready to go. And I'm sure someone is going to hear that and double check me on it. But they immediately, send out the U-boats that are seaworthy. They send them out into the northern approaches, and they just start raiding British commerce. And the first ship is actually sunk, I believe, on the 3rd, literally hours after the British had declared war. And this just continues really until the end of the war. And you also have the Germans with their surface fleet preparing to move out and conduct commerce raiding. And really, the period of the Phoney War goes from September of 39 until May of 40. But in that period, you really have the Battle of the Atlantic it's heated the entire time. The British lose an aircraft carrier at one point. The Germans lose several destroyers. The British lose several destroyers. It was not nearly as quiet as it was on land.
So things are starting to heat up much faster in the ocean, and that's one thing. But it's from what I remember in my history classes, the German strategy tended to depend on the Blitzkrieg, and you're saying it's been it was 8 months before Germans actually ended up moving.
Correct. So again, the Phoney War it's misleading because a couple of key things you got to keep in mind. One, the war is very real in the East. The Germans have invaded Poland. The Soviet Union invades Poland from the other side of Poland within 3 weeks of Germany's declaration of war. And about 6 weeks after the initial invasion, Poland it's done. It's out. Germany isn't really in a position to go ahead and turn around and start pushing westward.
Mm-hmm.
The British and the French don't realize this, or if they do, you have to give credit to German propaganda. They're fearful of just how powerful Germany is without realizing the reality of that situation. So Germany, after attacking Poland and invading Poland, they, despite Hitler's insistence that they get the show on the road and they move in the West, it takes close to 8 months before they're really and truly ready to push westward. And even then, you could argue that they never really were ready, and they just lucked out.
Wow, that's right. That's interesting. I can understand where the term the Phoney War comes from. Do you know where specifically it came from? It comes from the press?
So the press started using it, and the one source I found, and I was able to verify it, looking it up on a microfiche for a newspaper, was there was a U.S. senator, I believe he was from, I want to say, Idaho, and on the 19th of September, he's speaking with the press, and they ask, so what do you think of the situation that's going on in Europe? And he's like, oh, right now, if you ask me, the whole thing's phony. And I'm paraphrasing. Actually, I have it in my notes here. It was Senator Bora from Utah, and he just flat out said there's something phony about this war. And he's saying this, of course, in reference to the inaction on the Western Front. And again, the problem with that was you still had things happening on the Western Front. It just wasn't in the scale that people had expected after World War I.
Hmm.
You had something called the Saar Offensive, which was carried out by the French, in which they push into Germany, not very far, and they stop about a kilometer short of the Siegfried Line, which the Siegfried Line is a series of fortifications the Germans had built both from the last war and in response to the French building what's known as the Maginot Line. And they stop, and then shortly after Poland capitulates, they turn around and they go home.
So I'll get to the Maginot Line a little bit later. When does the Phoney War stop being so phony and start getting real?
So the Phoney War, like I said, it lasts for about a period of about 7 to 8 months. And then on April 6th, he's giving an address to Parliament. Neville Chamberlain, basically says, "Hey, Hitler's he's missed his bus. If this attack was going to happen on the west, it would have happened by now. No, nothing's happened." And 4 days later, suddenly the Germans invade Denmark, and then they prepare to move and invade Norway, which the British are also preparing to move into Norway in order to secure. Germany was doing it to secure their iron ore supply, whereas Germany knew that if they could cut that off, it'd be a big up for them.
So he's giving these speeches and he's waiting for Hitler, I guess, to get on the bus. What are the French and Germans doing during all this time? I mean, you said the Saar offensive, but Britain didn't do much, or what were they doing?
Well, Britain has the British Expeditionary Forces in Europe with the French, and the French and the British, their initial plan was we're going to deploy in France, build up our forces, and we're going to wait for the eventual German offensive to start. And when that does, we'll move to intercept it. Now, the belief by the French and the British at that time was that whatever German offensive was going to come, it was going to come through the Low Countries, so through the Netherlands, through Belgium, and into the north of France. So they're basically doing the Schlieffen plan redo. They're doing a more updated version. And the Germans, in the beginning, this was also their initial plan. Obviously nobody wants to attack fortifications head on, waste resources and men just getting through that, before you really get to the real action. So the German plan basically mirrors the British and French's expectations that they're just going to come through Belgium. The British and the French go to Belgium and they more or less ask them, hey, we're positive they're going to come through here. Let us in. We're going to build up defensive fortifications to stop whatever's coming. Don't leave us, hanging. And the Belgians, because they're hopeful that, hey, if we stay neutral, maybe nothing will happen. We don't want any trouble with the Germans. They refuse. And so the British and the French are more or less forced to stay in France while they're building up their forces. And while this is happening, Germany is rebuilding and resupplying and rearming their forces from after the action that has occurred in Poland. And now they're looking westward. They know they have to move west. And two big things happen that change that plan from going, okay, we're going to go crashing through the Low Countries like we did last time, and we're going to actually go ahead and go a different route entirely.
Okay. So in the notes you sent to us, you said that the Schlieffen Plan 2, Electric Boogaloo.
Yeah.
What exactly was the Schlieffen Plan? Was that something from World War One?
So yeah, the Schlieffen Plan was the plan from World War One, where the German and my World War One history isn't nearly as good, so I apologize in advance if I miss anything. Essentially, the German plan was to go crashing through Belgium into France, almost in a repeat of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, in which they would come crashing through the north of France, capture Paris, and then that's it. We won. They basically wanted to redo that plan, despite it. The last time around, it worked to a limited degree, but it obviously didn't completely work, since the Germans never took Paris in World War One, and they were stopped by the British and the French. A bit further into France than the Allies would have liked, but it was successful at the very least at pushing through Belgium.
Where do they decide to push through in the end?
So one thing that you've got to remember with France and Belgium is the geography to the north near the Channel. It's more wide open. It's more heavily trafficked. The roads are built up. It's much easier to get people in and out. But you had a small area known as the Ardennes area. It's a forested area, low valleys, almost mountainous, heavily forested, hard to move through with mechanized and armored units. Basically, what happens is a a German commander by the name of Erich von Manstein. German's not my first language, so I apologize if I mispronounce that. He comes up with a plan that instead of sending the bulk of the German Panzer mechanized units through the Low Countries, that they're going to use the Ardennes as almost a back door. And he comes up with a plan that, okay, we're going to take, at the time, the Germans had 16 modernized units. So you had your mechanized units and your Panzer units, or divisions.
Mm-hmm.
So the plan was, okay, we're going to take 10 of these, modernized units, and we're going to shove them through the Ardennes, and hopefully we can get through before anybody knows what's up. We'll come in behind where the majority of the British and the French are built up. And at first, the plan's ignored, but a couple of key things happen that make this the go-to plan. So in January, a German plane with a staff officer on board, it's downed in Belgium. It's known as the Mechlin incident. And on board the plane, they're carrying the plans for the main offensive that they had originally planned on, which was to go through the Low Countries and crash into northern France.
Oh.
The Germans don't know whether or not that plan got out. And the thing with operational security at this point is they have to assume, okay, it's likely that either if they didn't get the plan, we should probably assume that they did. Otherwise, it's going to backfire on us. So this happens, and that's one check in the corner for Manstein getting his plan up. The other event that happened was one of Hitler's staff officers was friends with Manstein and saw the plan, liked what he saw. So he presented it to Hitler, and Hitler, being not so much a rule by committee person, turned around and said, okay, you know what? That's what we're going with. This is the new plan. And one other minor event that occurred that kind of helped embolden the Germans was they had noticed that along the Maginot Line, whenever they had redeployed their forces in the frontier, the French were very slow to kind of shift their forces to match them. And that leads them to believe, okay, they're going to be slow about redeploying their forces. They don't expect anything to happen other than Belgium and the Netherlands and the north of France. So the Ardennes really seems like it's going to be our go for broke gamble. But the thing to remember is that going into the Ardennes, it's a huge gamble for Hitler. As I said earlier, the big thing for the British and the French was German propaganda had really driven home to them, hey, the Germans have this modern army, they have this modern air force that's just going to outmatch us in every way if we're not careful. And they were really fearful of getting bit by that. They knew that they could match it, but had they known the reality of it, that the Germans were taking all their modern stuff and kind of putting it to the front rather than spreading it out, I think they would have realized at the time, oh, actually this is beatable. But that's not what happened, obviously.
So we're all moving up towards the border, but I'm trying to remember. I thought France had like a sort of a line, or called the Maginot Line, like I think you mentioned. What was the Maginot Line? Wouldn't that have stopped them?
So the French built what was known as the Maginot Line in the mid to late 30s in response to Germany rearming itself, which is ironic because the Versailles Treaty had specifically outlawed it. And the first time that the Germans had violated the Versailles Treaty, the French had actually moved into the Ruhr region in the early 20s, and that helped stifle any disobedience. But now the strategy was less doing that and more, you know what? Let's just build up our border and rearm. You have the Spanish Civil War is happening, and you're seeing German units being used there. And so the belief at this point is we can't really go in and dictate to them anymore that they're not following the rules. So this massive, line of fortifications known as the Maginot Line again gets built up on the French frontier with the expectation that the Germans aren't going to use that. They aren't going to come crashing into that. It's a deterrent to push them to come up through Belgium and the Netherlands into the north of France. So it's almost like a speed bump. It's forcing the bulk of the German army to go around and to fight where the French army wants them to fight.
So the stereotype is usually like, oh, the French were so stupid to build this, but that was part of their intention, actually.
Correct. So they weren't building it. They weren't building it with the expectation that the German army was going to come crashing headfirst into it. And anybody that studies most fortifications tell you that most fortifications aren't built with the idea that it's going to stop anything that's coming at it. It's meant to slow down, tire out, and hopefully your enemy gives up, or by the time they get through that fortification, they meet another series of fortifications or defensive forces that are able to push it back further because they're worn out. If anybody's stupid, you could really, point the finger at the Germans, because the Germans went and made that error with the Atlantic Wall. But that's a topic for another day.
Yeah, we'll get to that another time, I'm sure. So what's kind of the next thing that happens in the series of events?
So, as I said earlier, Germany invades Denmark and Norway on April 10th. And at this rate, the British and the French, they send a smaller expeditionary force up to Norway to try help contain that issue. And at that time, no one really knows what's going to happen in mainland continental Europe, but everybody knows something's coming. Germans are obviously redeploying their forces to the west. They don't have any immediate threats that they have to worry about to the east. Denmark isn't an issue for them. They take the country within hours. Norway, it's a bit more drawn out, and that doesn't conclude itself really until mid-June. But again, that's not going to take up the bulk of the German forces. So everybody at this point, they know something's coming. And so really what happens is on May 10th, suddenly the Germans start enacting what's called Case Yellow, and they invade the Low Countries in France by circumventing the Maginot Line, as expected. And they send what is called Army Group B through Belgium and the Netherlands and into northern France. So this starts out with some airdrops on the Netherlands, and they take some key strategic dikes and airfields to prevent the Allies from being able to move up and take those. And they start pushing into Belgium. So as this is happening, the French and the British kind of have an aha moment and think, okay, just as expected. And so the British Expeditionary Force moves up with the French, the cream of the French army, up into Belgium to engage Army Group B. Now, as they do this, this is where the Ardennes offensive comes into play. You have about 10 mechanized and panzer divisions start pushing through the Ardennes. And this is where it's a huge gamble for the Germans, because they're really in a very limited funnel at this point. And it's a huge gamble because if the French or the British realize what's happening, if they're able to call their air power onto that small geographical area and just start, bombing the hell out of it, they've got them. You don't really want to have an armored column stuck in a very narrow place that's getting hit by air power. It's not a place you want to be in. So the Germans begin moving through the Ardennes, and believe it or not, you had a couple of French and British reconnaissance aircraft actually spot the movement coming through. And because the bureaucracy of the British and the French military at the time was so, and I don't want to say bloated, but it was just slow to respond to everything that was going on.
Mm-hmm.
They really didn't take it seriously until it was too late.
So the Germans are coming from the north, and the British kind of move to engage them, but then the old Germans are the stronger forces coming from the south.
Correct. So you have the British and the French move up to the north with the expectation, okay, this is where the German army's coming from. We don't have to worry about anything else. The Ardennes, only a fool would push things through there, so we don't have to worry about that. But the Germans, send, I guess, their traditional army. Army Group B is basically built up of their infantry and their horse-drawn artillery pieces, and it's not the modern German military that everyone is expecting that's meeting the British and the French in Belgium.
So they collapse so quickly because...
Well, so they don't initially collapse. At first, it's kind of seen as, okay, it might be a feint, and it's possible that the Germans are just trying to misdirect us. And so the French and the British commands, they keep their attention focused up north. But then a couple of key things happen, which really gets the gravity of the situation hits home. The British and the French, while they're up north, the German forces, their initial objective is to cross the Meuse River. And once they do that, they have two panzer divisions are able to make bridgeheads, and they're very weak, but they're able to cross the Meuse River and at that point continue moving westward towards the Channel coast. And one of the German commanders there is the infamous Erwin Rommel. So you have Rommel and another general known as Guderian pushing through, and they're pushing westward. Now, as this is happening, it's not as if the French and the British are completely ignoring them. They are sending forces to try repulse this breakthrough. The problem is the British Expeditionary Force, it's big, but it's not nearly as big as the French army. And they don't really have the luxury of, deploying assets all over France. They're really focused on northern France and Belgium. The French, their error is that when they go up to meet the German Army Group B in Belgium, they send, to put it bluntly, they send the best of their best up north with the expectation, hey, we need these guys up north. Nothing is going to happen back here that these guys are going to be needed for. And it's easy in hindsight to say, wow, that's a huge blunder. But at the time, I mean, it'd be like taking your star quarterback and holding him back. Like, well, we just want to wait and see how the game goes, and then maybe we'll put him in. You go to win from the very first movement. So, so the British and the French they've got their best forces up in Belgium, and Rommel, Guderian, and the rest of the German Army Group A, as they're called, cross the Meuse, and they just start hauling towards the Channel coast. And then as they're doing this, this is when panic really starts to set in at its earnest. You begin to have the British and the French, they start to realize, wait a minute, the Army Group B isn't as aggressive as they could be. And Army Group A is okay. And now they're starting to realize, okay, we have the possibility that we're going to be encircled. That, for obvious reasons, is not good.
What happens after they start to realize they might have a risk of being encircled?
So, as I said earlier, they do make a couple of attempts to break through and push back, and they're not successful. The problem being that the French, the forces that they send up against Army Group A, those forces they're not their best of the best. They're not the worst forces that they have, but it's a reserve army. It's not really the guys that you want to be in there when it's go time. And these guys, try as they might, they're unable to repulse the German advance back. So these initial attempts fall apart. And it should be noted at the same time that the Germans, you have this myth that the Germans, come crashing through and they're just unstoppable. I mean, they're taking significant losses as well. I mean, on the first day, they lose about 353 aircraft alone.
Wow.
That's, again, it's not great. If you're the British or the French, you don't know what they have to work with because they were working off of older intelligence assessments and unfortunately propaganda. The assumption was, well, they have much more where that came from, and there's no way we're going to be able to focus on it. And the other issue too is that because the Germans know exactly where they're trying to go, this is before radar. So you have the German Air Force is able to not operate with impunity, but it's much easier for them to concentrate and attack an area that they know of, where British and the French have such a wide area to defend. Where do you send your fighter patrols? What area is going to be best for you to put those guys into? And sometimes it worked out. More often than not, it didn't.
So they start realizing they can't get out. They start retreating from there.
And the German Army Group A, it hits the Channel coast on May 20th. And once they hit the Channel coast, that's when the realization comes in, okay, we're encircled. So the British immediately start to draw up contingency plans to get the British Expeditionary Force back towards a Channel port so they can pull their guys out of there. The problem with being encircled is, unless your name is Chesty Puller, you're not really in a position to be resupplied. You've got fire coming at you from multiple directions instead of just head on. You don't want to be in that position. And not only that, even if you have the best of your best in that small pocket fighting outwards, hey, they're going to run out of ammunition. They're going to take losses. They're going to need a break here and there. And you can't really give them any of those things if they're cut off from you. So the British begin to pull back towards Dunkirk around May 23rd. And at this time, as they're pulling back, the German High Command sees how quickly this encirclement has happened. But they've been operating for about 2 weeks at this point, nonstop. And they really need a moment to catch their breath. So one of the German high commanders, Rundstedt, he gives an order to halt the advance, and Hitler approves that order. And so for 3 days, the German army just kind of stays where they are. They don't move any closer. The British Expeditionary Force and the French First Army kind of hang out in Dunkirk and gradually pull back and reinforce their position. But again, hindsight is 2020. The British and the French don't know why the Germans are holding back, and to them, the expectation is at any minute now, German offensive could come through and really obliterate what we have.
Did you have any information about like how they got from where the encirclement to Dunkirk?
Yeah, so the British are up in Flanders. The British Expeditionary Force, I'll just call them BEF from now on for short, and the French First Army are up in the Flanders region of Belgium.
Mm-hmm.
And as the encirclement happens, they quickly realize we got to get out of here. So they start pulling back towards Dunkirk. Dunkirk does have port facilities that they can use. Calais is another city that they look to that they can use to evacuate their forces. Right now, as dire as it is, the idea isn't that, all is lost. It's just, okay, we have to pull out of here. We don't know what's going to happen after we pull out, but we do need to get out of here in a hurry.
Mm-hmm.
So, meanwhile, while the German forces are stopped, another reason that they're not really moving forward is Hermann Göring, the chief of the Luftwaffe, he tells Hitler, hey, let me use the Luftwaffe to knock this out and to prevent the British and the French from escaping. We can do this, no problem. Hitler initially signs off on it. And in the meantime, the British and the French are building up defensive fallback positions near Dunkirk and in that pocket so they can gradually pull their forces out.
Right. What makes Dunkirk so important that they moved to Dunkirk instead of Calais?
Well, the problem with Calais, from my understanding, was that the Germans were just pushing so closer to that. It was just really Calais is more towards the northwest of France, where the furthest extent of the western advance the German army was. That it made more sense to go kind of, I guess, the median of where that pocket was, and Dunkirk kind of fell on that median where, okay, it's a port. It does have quays and docks that we can, pull up alongside and get our guys on board and get them out of here. It's not the worst. It's not the best port facility in the world, but it's certainly not the worst. And the other thing too, was that Dunkirk, it's surrounded by, low, flat marshland that is really advantageous if you're defending it, because, especially from an armored advance, because if you have armor, coming across a wide, open, flat area for 4 or 5 miles, it's much easier to get an anti-tank gun to take its bearing on that
Makes sense.
than it is to knock out a couple hundred infantry advancing on you.
So the British decided it's definitely time to get out of here. It's getting a little bit too hot in here. How did they evacuate?
So the initial evacuation, it's drawn up by Admiral named Admiral Burton Ramsay, and he draws up plans that call for the BEF to pull back to Dunkirk, and they're going to start sending pretty much everything that the Royal Navy has to start pulling guys out as fast as possible. And then in addition to this, they also decide, okay, we've also got to call up the Merchant Marine, and the Merchant Marine is going to need to help get our guys out of here as well. So you start having British destroyers and troop transports and whatnot moving towards Dunkirk. The problem is they can't go straight to Dunkirk because of minefields and whatnot. So they have to take a bit of a longer route from England to Dunkirk before they can start loading people up. And this is where it really starts to get, I guess, scary for the British. Belgium surrenders on May 28th. The commander of the British Expeditionary Force, Lord Gort, he immediately realizes, okay, he's got to defend that. So his eastern flank is, it's wide open. So he sends in his 3 divisions, the 3rd, 4th, and 50th divisions, to fill that gap. While that's happening, you have elements of the French First Army. They're holding a small city called Lille.
Mm-hmm.
And they were meant to pull back with the British, but the French commander at the time, General Weygand, who had relieved previous French commander, he's a bit slow in issuing the withdrawal orders. So you have forces that end up trapped in Lille. But to their credit, you have really what amounts to only a couple of regiments or brigades holding, not brigades, maybe a couple of battalions or 2 regiments really holding this city. they're able to pin down or hold back 4 German divisions from really pushing onto Dunkirk. So the French fight a siege battle for about 4 days, and they tie up 7 German divisions. And this really gives the British time to pull their guys back and evacuate even more men. And it's to their credit, really, that the British were able to get as many guys out as they did. Otherwise, you would have had those 7 divisions. If they're not, being held up at Lille, they're moving on Dunkirk.
That makes sense. So the evacuation of Dunkirk was, of course, the topic of a very recent movie. To try to start to draw us toward a general conclusion, do you have anything to say about that movie? Where do they get things right and wrong?
I actually liked the movie a lot. I saw it with a friend of mine who is a combat veteran, and I'm not a veteran, but I've been around machine gun fire, and the first thing we both joked to each other was, oh yeah, they got that right. Not to really spoil anything, but at the very beginning of the movie, uh,
Mhm.
the sound effects are very, very well done. Um, to avoid rivet counting, which that's a phrase from another flaired user, Donald Draper, um, in which
Mhm.
historians will watch a historical movie and really miss the forest for the trees and 2 hours going, well, the jacket that guy was wearing was way off. They wouldn't have worn that jacket. If you ignore the rivet counting of that movie, I feel like it did a pretty good job of capturing the feel of what a lot of the people on that beach and the people coming to that beach felt at that time. And I mean, from the interviews I've read with veterans of that event, they've shared that belief that it did a good job of capturing that feel. It did get some things wrong. The BF 109s that the Germans are flying around, they have yellow noses. That didn't happen until about a month after Dunkirk. The
Right.
destroyer that you see in the movie, it's actually a French destroyer, but to be honest, you show most people a French destroyer and a British destroyer without any insignia. And from that time, I
No,
highly doubt the majority of people would know the difference. And then I guess the other thing was the director Christopher Nolan didn't want to use CGI, and so he avoided showing, I guess, how many people were really there. I guess the best way I could summarize it was it was a minimalist take on Dunkirk. Um,
Mhm.
I'm thinking of one movie in particular that did a pretty good job of showing the scale of the beach that used CGI. This movie that came out about 10 years ago called Atonement. And there's a brief scene where one of the main characters is trapped on Dunkirk, and they kind of pull the camera back to show you how many people and how much equipment was really just piling up at the beach waiting to go home. Yeah, a friend of mine, he runs a podcast called The Road Home with his cousin, and they review movies on the road home. And he did a really good job reviewing Dunkirk. Neither of these guys have history backgrounds, but hearing that review, it really helped nail home, hey, this movie did a good job of conveying to the average person that isn't a historian why this event was so important and why it was so nerve-wracking, and at the end so vital that everyone was able to they were able to pull so many British and French forces out of Dunkirk. So I definitely recommend if anybody wants to get a good listen for the land.
So let's bring it to like a final conclusion now after Dunkirk and everything. We finally reached the end. There's only Britain left to fight against Germany.
Well, so that's where it's a bit misleading. Dunkirk happens. The British are able to evacuate, about 330,000 of their forces and some of the French forces. But the fighting in Europe isn't really done. France doesn't surrender for another 2.5, 3 weeks. You still have British forces elsewhere in Britain or in France, and you had at the time Churchill was actually, entertaining the idea of sending a second expeditionary force to try create a redoubt in Brittany with French forces, so they
Mhm.
could still have a foothold on mainland Europe. Fortunately, one of Churchill's generals, General Brooke, told him it's probably not a great idea. We're really the best thing we could do is just to get everybody out of there. So really, the Dunkirk is, I guess, the best analogy I could think of is it's to use a football analogy, it's the 3-and-28 moment. If you watch the Super Bowl last year, the Patriots are, they have a score of 3 and the Falcons have a score of 28, and you've got, less than 20 minutes of game time to go, and everyone, at that point wouldn't have been faulted for thinking, okay, the Falcons have this, they're going to win. And once France surrenders and falls, most people saw Britain, holding their own, but for a brief period, you really wouldn't have been, looked at as a crazy person if you had said, hey, there's no way that the Germans don't win this war. So even though, Britain is standing alone, they are getting support from their Commonwealth nations. So, Canada, South Africa, Australia are sending, supplies and troops. America, in the war officially, but they are sending supplies, through Lend-Lease. And the Battle of Atlantic is still raging, but, the American Navy and Coast Guard are, kind of quasi fighting that war, which is another topic for another day. Britain really isn't as alone as she looks at that time.
You've given us a great overall and wholly comprehensive history of how things started off in the Second World War and then eventually led to Dunkirk and then kind of left us up this bleak hanging thing. But I guess hindsight is sort of 2020. We know what's coming.
I'm sorry. I mean, you have Churchill's, we shall fight on the beaches, and their finest hour speeches, right around this time. And, Churchill, he's got a lot of faults, but you got to give him credit. He kind of knew how to take a really disastrous. I mean, Dunkirk was a disaster, but he was able to take that and turn it around into, hey, we're still here. We're down. We're not out. In hindsight, it's easy to look back on that and be like, oh, it wasn't a big deal. But at the time, I mean, it's pretty impressive.
So I think we will definitely have a follow-up thread in Ask Historians for people to come by and to ask some more questions. And I hope you will join us there.
Yeah, certainly.
Thank you for joining us today on the Ask Historians podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/askhistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.